I'm really interested in this double-edged sword of access to digital materials. On one hand, preserving privacy or rights of artists. On the other hand, the kinds of creative use that I know we all deploy, which also feels very different now in 2025 when those same materials are being absorbed and consumed by tech oligarchs to produce their endlessly growing and world-destroying large language models.
A lot of the friction that can happen in chains of information and cutting people off from chains, it's not really about the tools that are being used, it's about our agency in our actions with the tools that we use and the knowledge that we have.
I never would have dreamed of language not equal. These are things I don't want to pretend to predict. The absence of metadata is one of the things I'm also most proud of.
What your book does very well, Danny, is it excavates that past tradition of sharing that I think later generations weren't necessarily exposed to.
Hi, and welcome. I'm honored to be hosting this conversation with the University of Minnesota Press podcast today. My name is Danny Snelson. I'm an associate professor in the departments of English and Design Media Arts at UCLA, where I also serve as faculty in the Digital Humanities Program, the Laboratory for Environmental Narrative Strategies, and the UCLA Game Lab. In my research, teaching, and creative practices, I focus on unlikely constellations of poetry and poetics, experimental writing and art, material texts, network cultures, and emerging genres. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by three personal heroes gathered on the occasion of the publication of my book, The Little Database, A Poetics of Media Formats, published by the University of Minnesota Press as the 64th edition to the Great Electronic Mediation series, edited by Anne Catherine Hales, Peter Krapp, Rita Rayleigh, and Samuel Weber. The book is now available in print as an ebook and an open access edition hosted by the Manifold platform, which features the full book as well as a wide range of expanded digital materials that we'll discuss shortly. But first, I'm eager to introduce my interlocutors, Vicki Bennett, Craig Dworkin, and Luca Massara. From Craig's mentorship that reaches back to the earliest stages of my academic training, to Luca's inspiring work as my student at UCLA and beyond, to Vicki's multimedia practice as People Like Us, which I've admired from afar over the past 20 years, I'm floored to be in conversation with these three inspirations today. The project is indebted to each of them more than they likely know, and I'm simply excited to have the opportunity to learn more from each to enrich some of the themes and concepts from the book. I'll invite them to introduce themselves before giving some summary comments on the Little Database, which will then open up a conversation to put our various works and practices in relation to the book. So I think let's go alphabetical. Vicki, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, I am Vicki Bennett and I work under the artist name People Like Us. I've been working with editing and re-editing, composing and decomposing pre-existing material for my entire adult life, so 30 plus years. The work takes the form of movies, live performances, gigs, albums, and more recently, I've been partaking in a PhD, which is at age 55, I started it. So before that point, I was not involved particularly in academia. So I kind of just jumped in the deep end there. So since then, I've been writing about my practice rather than practicing. But that said, a lot of my work has always been text-based because it's process-led. It involves working with mind maps and making transparent the way that I edit and bring things together.
Wonderful. So much more to say on all of that. But Craig, can we turn things over to you?
Yeah, Craig Dworkin. I'm at the University of Utah, where Danny told me it was okay for me to come. I told Danny it was okay for him to stay at Princeton, and he told me it was okay to move to Salt Lake City, where I teach literary history and theory and the history of the avant-garde. I'm really happy to be here.
Wonderful. It's great to see you, Craig, and hear you, I guess, since we're on a podcast. Now, Luca.
Hi, my name is Luca Massara. I'm honored and thrilled to be in this company. I am a PhD candidate in English at Stanford University. I'm a digital humanist, a media and archival theorist, and a literary sociologist of around post-1960 US literary culture. And more specifically, my work right now in my dissertation is on the advent of print on demand and how that technology has changed the way we produce, experiment with, and receive these things called literary texts. I'm also a poet and a bookmaker who operates under the label of Undocumented Press. And if you look hard enough, you could probably find one of those books in your local research library.
Wonderful. Thank you, Luke. I know where ours is hidden at UCLA, but I'll keep that secret for now. I want to thank everyone again for joining. Before launching into conversation, I suppose it will be helpful for the listener if I offer some summary comments on the Little Database project and why I'm excited to discuss it with my guests. Generally, I think these summaries start with an origin narrative. For me, the Little Database has multiple entry points. As a document, it first cohered as a dissertation submitted for my doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania in 2015, but it also contains works made as an editor for the sites I discuss in the book, including PenSound, UbuWeb, Eclipse, and the Electronic Poetry Center, where I've worked on and off over the past 20 years. Or really, it could be said to have begun when I started scanning, yes, back at Princeton, scanning some magazines for Craig as a work study student in 2004. Since then, it's grown to include creative media poetics projects interfacing with emerging writing technologies like large language models and other ordinary media platforms in the present. One of the things that I found fascinating about a long-term research project like this one is just how much it's changed over the years. What began as an inquiry into what I saw as cutting-edge media practices in the aughts has grown into a historical reflection on an earlier time in the internet from 2 decades removed. Where I'm now returning to what I think of as latent potentials in these residual digital repertoires that persist in the shadow of today's always on, social media driven, hyper capitalized, and increasingly AI dominated digital networks. More succinctly, when I began the project, I was using the idea of little to work against what was then called, and now sounds quaint, called big data. Today, I think the little more directly speaks to the largeness of large language models whose massive computation are transforming our relation to data more generally, and I should note, most often for the worse. These efforts, these large data efforts, stake their hopes for meaningful interpretation on the parsing of enormous amounts of information. In the humanities, the state, and the public sector alike, this logic is consistent with pervasive data valence, fintech and medtech predictive technologies, and global systems of neoliberal or techno-feudal informatic control. There's much more to say, of course, on all these developments, but for now, I'll just say that the project is directly responding to these currents by turning to the little database as an alternative and integral model for understanding our place in a rapidly changing information environment. More intimately, it aims to make sense of the idiosyncratic collections of everyday digital objects that we all carry around every day. You can think of like a few hundred PDF files on your desktop, 1,000 neglected photo captures on your phone, an old collection of MP3 or movie files on a hard drive somewhere gathering the digital equivalent of dust. These ordinary collections are at once far too large to read in a traditional sense, as anyone attempting to make sense of their own desktop file hierarchies can tell you, while also remaining significantly below the threshold for significant computational analysis. But more on that shortly. If one half of the project is to use the little as a way to resist trends in massive computation and analytics, analytic currents in the digital humanities, the other half deploys the little in relationship to the little magazine. Like the little magazines of the historical avant-gardes, the little databases that I examine in the book offer what I consider a dynamic forum for investigating a global situation of politics, aesthetics, and meaning in a time of pervasive technological change. The methodological challenges faced by periodical studies, where full runs can number hundreds of issues containing thousands of individual works, as well as ads, circulation histories, and a range of material, text, contexts. Uh, all of these things mirror the sites I examine. Importing the study of these sites into the context of the Little magazine offers a kind of backdoor entry into a longer history of textual studies and editorial theory. This is a way for me to approach the forensic materiality that textual scholars have introduced to born digital objects or the infrastructural turn in media studies. I call the operant methodology of my project contingent reading, which is built out of the contingent methods described by Alan Liu as a kind of postmodern historicist hermeneutic zigzag that relational databases demand. I've recently published on this framework in relationship to the speculative video game Death Stranding as a way to think about the fetch quest alongside ordinary search queries. In the little database, I contend that every interpretive act is a kind of fetch quest, attempting to make sense of a shifting terrain that's subject to unpredictable and conditional situations. Finally, one note on media poetics, then I'll stop. Instead of an academic paper that simply addresses the media as a kind of external object, I'm interested in how we might imagine creative media practices as performing scholarship in their own right. This follows a trend in the digital humanities toward building or constructing knowledge as a kind of scholarly practice. Jerome McGann and Lisa Samuels perhaps best encapsulate this approach with their term deformance, which they define as an academic performance working within the materials that it studies to surface unseen aspects of the work, a kind of critical remix practice or scholarly making. So, beyond the chapters proper, I should note that the book, The Little Database, also includes a Python generated work of remix, a fraudulent generative magazine bootleg, an audio essay, a database movie, and an indexical experiment with generative writing. So, in this way, the Little Database attempts to offer both creative tactics and contingent reading methods for making meaning within these collections, drawn from the print history of the Little magazine, the unlikely afterlives of media-specific works of art and letters, and a range of media poetics for the transformative production of knowledge. Throughout, I argue, or attempt to argue, the online versions of works in these collections are not only transformed at every point of access, but that these versions, these digital versions circulating online, transform our understanding of each historical work in turn. Okay, that's more than enough for me to get started. I was thinking it might be great to start our conversation with a concrete example drawn from where the book ends, with Vicki Bennett, aka People Like Us, whose phenomenal compilation movie We Edit Life has been an inspiration to me for years, and to my students, I should add. So, Vicki, I was wondering if you can just tell us a little bit about that work and its origins within the Prelinger collection and the Internet Archive.
Okay, well, it's a celebration of the internet, but beyond that, it's a celebration of being able to network with people near and far, beyond the local, basically. One big part of it is that it occurred at the beginning of high-speed computing and high-speed internet, and also the beginning of file sharing. So that would be things like Napster, where you could go and discover what's in other people's folders in their computers, which is a massive thing, in terms of reaching out beyond the local and the mundane of the local. But also, as soon as I got broadband, I knew that there was this thing called archive.org, and I'd heard that someone had been persuaded to put a bunch of films up there. And before that point, I'd been working for 10 years with audio and a little with video, but generally kind of analog scratch video. And so it was just amazing to find this archive, the Prelinger archives. And I immediately emailed Rick, and he replied straight away. A friendship started. It's a celebration of that as well, of not just the archive, which can mean all sorts of things, but the archivist, the person who helps you navigate the archive. And then I'm helping people navigate the archive as well. And so it's a kind of a self-conscious journey through that experience. And so it is a performative thing where I'm acting out the fact that I'm an editor. So we edit life. I'm editing my life in that relationship with that media with great joy. And also great joy that I was finally able to use tools that I've been dreaming of my whole life. Adobe After Effects for drawing around things, and Pro Tools free. And the fact that Pro Tools was available once for free is very hard to imagine now.
Yeah, I sketched some of that, the way that the affordances of not just the nascent Internet Archive, but the Pro Tools and these, like, the democratization, I guess, of filmmaking practices that film deploys. But I love this personal angle to We Edit Life. On one hand, that's one of the things I've been trying to do, is how do you connect these public presentations or public collections like the Internet Archive to these private collections of things that we have on our desktops. One of the things I found really fascinating, I'm not sure if it made it in the book, was how much of the Internet Archive was actually generated by your calls. Like, he was actively digitizing these films and you were pulling from a catalog. And so the production of this film also produced the Internet Archive in some ways. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it was a commission by Love Bites, who were a media organisation, arts media in the north of England. So I had a little bit of money to give Rick. He was just doing it for me anyway. They gave me some money to digitize stuff with Rick. So Rick would give me bits of his database, which he had in a document that what was the name of something edit? Anyway, you'll remember the name of the document in a minute. And he had all his text database, and then I could word search it. And then I would, because I couldn't preview it, because I was in London and him in San Francisco, I'd say, well, what's that one like? And then he would verbally explain it to me. And then I go, oh, yeah, that's what I need. And then he got to understand what I liked. And then he'd start suggesting it. And then he'd digitize it. And then if it wasn't in the archive, he'd add it to the archive.
It's amazing. And I think it's that search practice that I also found really inspiring about the work. That, so much of the history of studying found footage films is about this like meta cinematic critique, or you have these clips that are from some like impossibly obscure sources and you'll never find them. So it's not worth even thinking about where the samples actually come from. I feel like that film that you made also was one of the first times where I could search for every one of the clips, and I could watch your film, but also use your film as a kind of index or access point to a whole range of like unlikely industrial films, family home videos, and so on. It's one thing that I've wanted to know more is how you relate to the samples you use. I know you're researching sampling techniques now. There's always like a musical quality and a sense of like playfulness in the work you make. I'm curious how you think about how it interfaces with these various historical dimensions, ranging from We Edit Life all the way to the new work you're doing with Library of Babel. There's a notable clip where you're working with Barbie, for example, and kind of animating these characters, bringing Barbie in conversation with sci-fi films from the 50s, and a really rich array of some very recognizable sources and some that are quite obscure. And I'm curious about how you think about the history of the source material you use.
Well, when I was doing that, 23 years ago, I didn't think about it in the way that I am now, because I wasn't educated. I hadn't educated myself to it. And I think you said in your book that you were educated partly through searching these archives. That's how I got educated too. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have any kind of idea or critique of what I was doing. I was just doing it. In the same way as many years earlier, I didn't know about plunderphonics. I was just using samples, and someone told me. And so there wasn't any kind of explanation for why I was doing it then. I just pieced it together. And actually, when you wrote about it, I understood it way more than I understood it. You understood it way more. And it's quite funny to pick up on what you said then, because I'm reading about all those people now. Now I'm doing my PhD all these years later, which just goes to show linearity works in various directions. What was the question again?
Oh, that was great. That was great. No, and I think that the linearity there, I wanted to connect maybe with some of what Luca's been doing. So much of my education came from these collections and from the archives, like Internet Archive or UbuWeb or Eclipse. Having been there as those things were emerging was one type of experiment or one type of experience where I'm interested, Luca, in how you relate to you've been doing a lot of research with the Internet Archive today, which is less this kind of like open space that's building something brand new and rather a kind of precarious collection that's subject to erasure, or what you call vanishing culture or fragile records. And I wonder if we can maybe like bridge some of these like origins that Vicky helping to generate the online Prelinger collection to the type of preservation and advocacy work that you've been doing.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of false public sentiment around something like the Internet Archive or on little databases in general that thinks of them as like these like harbingers of piracy that are intentionally just trying to like kind of steal from artists and to not give them their money's worth. But I think Vicky's example here is like great insofar as it points to remix culture as something that's very like respectful of the original source material and that utilizes it in innovative and creative ways. And it's something that is in danger of disappearing as a result of a change in media distribution that I talk about in this report that I just published last year with the Internet Archive called Vanishing Culture. In particular, that report was focusing on a transition from file ownership of like, say, the early 2000s and the 90s and like media ownership more broadly to something like streaming and licensing. And as a result of which people aren't as able to do this sort of remixing of culture if they're not able to actually access the files themselves. Of course, if you're like a very tech savvy person, there's ways in which you could access these files, but by and large, the transition sort of inhibits the public's ability to play this kind of critical role and participate in an archival tradition and participating in a remix tradition.
So that the Vanishing Culture Report, one, I would just love to hear you talk a little bit more about that. And I am really interested in this kind of double-edged sword of access to digital materials. On one hand, preserving privacy or rights of artists. On the other hand, the kinds of creative use that I know we all deploy, which also feels very different now in 2025 when those same materials are being absorbed and consumed by these like tech oligarchs to produce their endlessly growing and world destroying large language models. So I'm interested, I guess, and I know this is something you think about a lot, Luca, is the politics of use and the politics of, in particular, the use of these kinds of digital objects. And would love to hear you maybe parse some of how you're thinking about access, piracy, things like shadow libraries, but also permission-based archives in the present.
Thank you, Danny. So we had a lot of conversations when we were drafting the Vanishing Culture Report around this exact question of when is it bad for there to be maximum access to materials? In particular, this comes up with like questions such as sacred knowledge and religious knowledge that might not circulate or should not circulate more broadly. And so one of the purposes of the report was to kind of critique against premature loss of digital materials that have been caused as a result of these transitions into something like streaming or licensing, or as a result of extended copyright laws, which have been lobbied for by big corporations like Disney, which make it such that publications that are 30, 40, 50 years old are essentially impossible to access unless you actually go to a research library. And so there's a politics of access there where what I'm interested in is a broader public access to materials, so long as that access is the way I define sort of a cultural publication is just something that's intentionally disseminated and distributed to a wider audience. And so I wouldn't want something that isn't intentionally desired to be out there to continue to be out there against people's wishes. But I do think that if somebody intentionally puts something out there and they're okay with it being out there, then it should circulate. I was definitely seduced by that information desires to be free thing at a young age, as somebody who sort of came of age with the early internet. I remember being exposed to torrenting when I was 10 and having no idea what exactly it was, but just being sort of in awe of the fact that somebody could access all these materials online however they desired. I hold on to that sort of utopian vision. And I think what your book does very well, Danny, is it excavates that past tradition of sharing that I think later generations weren't necessarily exposed to and who have inherited an internet that's fundamentally different than the internet of the late 20th century and the early 21st century.
Yeah, I'm almost shocked that you were torrenting at all. I think, with my increasingly with my students that they've had no encounter with that. And of course, Luca's made, I'll just plug an amazing book called Seed that works with the artistry of various kinds of hackers and whereas demo scene producers in ASCII format with torrent distribution. But all those repertoires are disappearing. Downloading has moved toward streaming. And the kind of repertoires that I developed, I think mostly with Craig, and I wanted to maybe turn to you, thinking about just how different it was to be scanning and producing these kinds of materials when it felt really vital, I guess, in the year 2000 to surface, say, rare small press poetry books and magazines that would be impossible to access otherwise. It feels really different now when everything is there, it seems like everything is there, or to be like a kind of amateur archivist who's scanning things in independently feels very different now that every library has digitization officers and JSTOR is releasing these massive collections of rare magazines somewhat regularly. I'm interested in I think just across the board, Craig and also Vicky, how you're thinking about your relationship to these kinds of collections now versus how you maybe were thinking about them as they emerged in the 20-aughts.
I'm always amused by the fact that Eclipse and Google started in the same year. I always remember this because it startled me so much. This is back when telephones used to be attached to the walls of buildings. And I had a telephone in my office, in the basement office at Princeton, that I didn't even know the number to. I never gave it to anyone because I didn't want anyone to contact me. But it rang one day. It scared the shit out of me. It was really loud. And it was Larry Page, who I'd never heard of. And he had this company I'd never heard of. But he had this plan to scan so many books it would be as deep as the ocean. We would swim in an ocean of books. He said, he gave me like this 2-minute elevator pitch. And then he said, could Google use the Eclipse titles to start their collection of books? And there were maybe 20 of them. This speaks to the little part of this at a point where 20 books looked like, wow, well, we could get a head start here. The point being that obviously they were prescient. They named it Google. I could have named Eclipse, Score, like maybe we will someday have 4 score books on there. And they obviously increased exponentially and geometrically. While you maybe even know how many books are on Eclipse now, we've grown incrementally, arithmetically. And I think that one thing that feels different to me now about the project is what a collection means when the rest of the internet is so much larger, just by these orders of magnitudes of data, and increasingly commercialized, which is to also say increasingly homogeneous. So somehow we have there's much more, at least at a kind of infrastructure level. Whatever interesting things people are doing doesn't mean that there aren't these interesting things. But they're all on WordPress, or they used to all be on Tumblr a decade ago or whatever. And I think that makes something like Eclipse feel much more eccentric than it used to be. I think there's questions about poetry culture that we could throw in there as well that highlight the same eccentricity. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I love this. There's 2 things that makes me think of. One, I love the, I didn't know this history about Larry Page and the 20 books of Eclipse potentially being at the origin of Google Books and their massive accumulation of literature. It does remind me of what really inspired the interlude to chapter 2, which is a kind of fraudulent bootleg of Language Magazine, which I know is the most accessed magazine in the collection. A very, very important document that Craig has worked on quite a bit, infamously underread document in literary history. I discovered at a certain point the Allen Institute for AI had done this research around what websites large language models had absorbed. And I discovered that they had absorbed, so on the other side of Google Books starting alongside Eclipse, that all of Eclipse had somehow been absorbed by these large language models that do produce this kind of plain internet vernacular in general, but somewhere in like the dark heart, say, of ChatGPT, the entirety of the Eclipse archive is there. Like it knows language poetry, it knows these like experimental approaches to the politics of language. And so in that work, I'm trying to resurface that in some ways and put that back in dialogue with some of the original print materials. The other half of what I found really interesting, what you were just talking about, Craig, is just how exciting the hand-coded internet is becoming for young artists and writers. I've been interested in this, what people are calling the web revivalism. Young artists are using things like NeoCities to produce these outlandish, hand-coded websites as a kind of rejection of the filter bubbles that I think most of these young artists have grown up entirely within their entire lives. What might have been like an intuitive practice or a matter of necessity in hand coding the HTML of Eclipse, which has remained really quite constant, has somehow transformed over the course of a quarter century into maybe a really exciting potential for new forms of creative practice on the internet. It's like return, like, I don't know, as a kind of like retro process, but also like returning as maybe a kind of digital practice that has resistance built into it or has more control in a digital space, which is swiftly decimating what was once known as, say, like the commons or the digital commons to become a hyper-gated, hyper-controlled space.
I want to say one thing about it, and then I want to ask you about it, because it strikes me as being, really perverse to hand type these plain text files. Feels like we mentioned the Xerox machine, but it feels more like, I don't even know what they use, crystal set ham radio operators or something like that. There's really no good reason to do it, I think. The thing I want to point out that I do like about it is every time I log on to the Bluehost down in Orem, I have to click through pop-up ads about whether I want to optimize Eclipse in search engines and how I'm going to drive commercial traffic to this completely non-commercial site. And what I like is that there's basically no metadata at all because and this goes back to something Luca was saying, that I don't want to imagine what people will do with that material when I make it available. I never would have dreamed of language not equal. These are things I don't want to pretend to predict. And so the absence of metadata is one of the things I'm also most proud of on this site. But I wanted to ask you what some of the latent potentials you see in the obsolescence, because I'd love for it to be something other than just perversity and ineptitude.
I love the yes, almost the occult practice of handwriting HTML files. Yeah, I think that there's a number of things that are latent, or the latent potential, and I like this rejection of metadata. One of, I think, the most sad developments in the digital humanities is, think about all of the hours people spend doing like textual encoding, like the TEI initiative, and these sort of like hours and hours of like producing the metadata to make a rich text. That, imagine somebody's going to use it, and I don't know how many humans actually use TEI, but it certainly helped train large language models, and it certainly helped make some people billions of dollars. And I think it's like within that space, like in relationship to the current landscape of the internet, which is driven by these like five major companies, that the idea, like the very empowering idea that one can actually just write a web page by hand, it's almost shocking, I think, to my students. Like they don't know that that's even like a possibility. And once they realize, well, it's really not that hard. Like it's, a CSS tag is really like, you can make the background change its color, or you can drop a GIF in. Maybe more troubling, and the other side of that is my students are also like producing these NeoCities websites by vibe coding. So they're prompting large language models to try to write things that look like they were handmade in the 90s. And I think it's like those like historical disconnections, or it's like putting those things in relationship to each other, that has a kind of charge. And I think when writing the little database, I was really returning to these things that were produced in the aughts, or the late 90s, and finding all kinds of ways that they just offered different models or different imaginaries to what the internet could have become, what it might still be, different modes of empowerment for users to produce things, or make things out of these materials. When you're just streaming movies, for example, you're not able to cut them together and key them up in the way that Vicky does so brilliantly. So I think like Eclipse is also something that can be downloaded, moved around, and then used in any number of ways that the user might want to, from being able to read it on a device they like, to being able to remix it to produce something entirely new.
I just want to add in, because you mentioned the vibe coding of these sort of old school websites. I'll age myself a little. I had an old school HTML website back in the day, and what I appreciated about it is I was aware who I was stealing my HTML from when I was like trying to learn how to do it, and there was sort of like a politics of like, oh yeah, at least for me, I should like recognize who it is I was taking my HTML and my CSS from, and that's something that's kind of masked by the LLM. Right? When you're kind of vibe coding and you're just trying to generate this old school looking website, you miss this kind of like, I guess we could call it an infra-thin care politics of like, oh, we should probably recognize the people we were taking from in the first place. And then more tangentially, I think obsolescence, to me at least, promotes like opportunities for nostalgia and mourning. And Danny, what I kind of want to ask you is like, is the little database as a project a kind of nostalgic and mourning project in itself?
Oh, that's really nice. In some ways, yeah, I think, mourning the practices that, where one had, say, more sense of agency, or where the internet held this kind of sense of promise. My colleague, Chris Kelty, writes about being a historian of the internet that could have been. And I think, in looking back to these models, that internet that could have been, remains a virtual possibility for other forms of connection in the future, forms of networking or connection, or creative production that are more agential, that are able to work with real contexts and real histories. I think that erasure of context that large language models invoke is one of the most troubling aspects, right? So there's famous AI piece, This Person Does Not Exist, where every time you load a page in the browser, you get another face that like quote unquote doesn't exist. And that made a lot of headlines when it was released. But of course, all those faces really do exist. It turned out that really it was just sort of like slightly tweaked actual photos of people that really do exist. It's just that their history and their context had been removed. And so when I look at whether it's the magazines that are hosted by Eclipse, on one hand, you have the bibliographic data there, Craig. So I can go back and I know where these materials emerge from. I can learn about the material history of these documents. But I can also, and this is the argument I'm trying to make in the book, think about the context of like Language Magazine as it lives on Eclipse. And that's one of the things I was really trying to do, is to like take those digital objects and those experiences seriously, so that they're not just some kind of indexical relationship to, say, like a film that might have screened at some point on celluloid, and I just happen to be having this degraded experience in like a shitty flash video file. Instead, I was trying to think, as somebody who grew up in rural Utah and accessed avant-garde materials mostly through my browser, I had very meaningful experiences seeing, as distorted as it was, seeing Stan Brakhage on YouTube. And I wanted to think, well, can I take that Stan Brakhage film on YouTube seriously and think about its context? And so I think it's an additive process throughout, that these files carry their histories, but their meaning or our way of understanding them has layers of history and context that can be parsed and traced and searched and found. And this is really, to go back to where we began with We Edit Life. One of the things I found so fascinating about that is I could like access both like the distant historical production of these works and their circulation on the internet in a specific moment. So it was context additive rather than context subtractive.
Yeah, I think, context, as you've said, changes all the time, and there's never one context. It's always relational. And I think a lot of what we talk about is the way that things are relational and how they can stand next to each other. They can overlap in the, like an infrathing. But also what you're saying about authenticity. Authenticity is a weird one, because we can often assume that authenticity starts with our knowledge of it or someone else's knowledge of it, whereas something from 200 years ago, they weren't having those problems then. It's suppose you've got a public house and you try and make it look like an older public house. I mean, like a pub. Supposing you make a bar look like a diner. Someone goes in there and they go in there and they have the authentic experience in the diner, and then they find out it wasn't a diner, it was something else. So what bit is authentic and what isn't? Who's lying? And so what I'm saying is, even with the LLMs, it's not really what you're doing, it's what's your intentions. Is it a knowing intention, or that you just don't know, which is okay as well? Not knowing, we've all done the not knowing. We don't know most things. We only know what we know. So what I'm saying is, a lot of the friction that can happen in us talking about, chains of information and cutting people off from chains, it's not really about the tools that are being used. It's about our agency in our actions with the tools that we use and the knowledge that we have.
Yeah, can I tie something together that Vicky was saying about knowing and not knowing, and that Luca was saying, and that I think speaks to a kind of social prehistory of the technologies that led to Eclipse, and a dynamic that you'll have something smarter to say about, but I just want to note the dynamic that I'm thinking, because I'm still thinking about the Xerox machine, which technologically does one thing, but the social and political life of the Xerox machine in the late 80s and the early 90s, which was part of sharing with people that you knew. Or I think we used to have Kinko copy shops, and in Berkeley, where I went to grad school, we had Krishna Copy, which before they got hit with a huge copyright infringement lawsuit, which would for a few dollars would copy entire books for you in the afternoon. But you did that to share with your reading group, or you did that to make pamphlets that you would hand out you'd exchange with people at a poetry reading, or you were in seminar and you wanted to share an article with people. And Now I feel like there's lots of sharing, but it's indexical. You say, have you seen this streaming here? And that obviously, and this is the obvious part that maybe you can say more about, that I knew those people. And part of what's great and not great about the online archive is I don't know all the people, like, I don't want to imagine what they're going to do with this material. I also don't know who they are to begin with. And I wonder if that dynamic is something that animates these databases for you in some way.
Yeah, that's a really rich set of things. I want to pick up on both of these. I was thinking about the not just say maybe not authenticity or agency, but experience. Like the question of like experience and the performance of cultural encounter, with say a diner, like a pub that's dressed up like a diner, so you have a diner experience. I was reminded of this great anecdote that Bruce Sterling used to tell when defining the atemporal. What do you call the atemporality? Which is this was like early internet, right after, say, you could order anything you wanted on Amazon. That if you wanted to live as an astronaut, it'd be really easy to just like buy up things on eBay and produce an astronaut station in your home, and like eat dried food and like walk around in a spacesuit, and you could like experience the life of an astronaut from home. And he found this to be like a really interesting like interruption to like historical time, and that was like actually like produced by the internet. And I think that kind of like temporal dislocation, Craig, has a lot to do with experience, encounter, and connection with these digital materials. For me, I have some very cherished .mp4 files that I keep kind of close at hand, that are more valuable to me, say, than a VHS cassette tape or of like a video art piece. In the same way that my printed version that I made when I was an undergrad, where I just printed out the entirety of Language Magazine, and I annotated it, by hand. It was just on like shitty 8.5 by 11 paper that's all like crumpled and it has all this age. Like, that's to me the most valuable edition of Language Magazine that I know about, and so. I think that there is something interesting to pick up on both of these threads, and trying to like take digital experiences seriously, and two, to think about them within these social contexts. So those are also the links that I send to people, or sharing a file is very different than the like indexical reference, like, have you seen X streaming on Y, as opposed to what I like to do in my grad seminars, for example. Here's a zip file with 300 books that we're going to study, and like, what kind of strategies can we all develop together to unpack these 300 books together. And I think it's so it's always in that kind of like connection, or in the social space in which culture lives, that I think that meaning is most potently felt. Even these things that feel kind of like anonymous, like non-social media objects, like Eclipse, that are SEO resistant, that are hand coded, that aren't trying to optimize for shares on social media, they still have rich social lives, and they have profound effects, I think, on one, how we encounter these historical objects, but how, increasingly my students are going to encounter these objects, that they're not going to be able to access most of these materials in person. We all know how rare it is to see, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Vicky, how rare it is to see celluloid in person. And, how do you teach like the history of like structural film when you can't actually see the celluloid? And does that just mean that my students will never have a meaningful experience of those films? Or are there ways in which those meaningful experiences can be articulated otherwise? I'm not sure if that was a question, Vicky, but I'd love to hear. But you do so much with like mediation in your work. It's one of the things I love, is you have all these like really smart ways, up to like, in Library of Babel, where you process these historical film characters where they look like they're walking in and out of these digitized pixels, where you bring these like really wild different points in history together, but you keep a lot of the noise, you keep the static and the hiss and the scratches in the celluloid, in your films. And I guess I'd love to hear your thoughts on like, yeah, how do you think about playing, I guess, media history in that way?
I think actually I like other people to play it out for me. So what I do is I show the connections between things. And so if someone said, what is the main thing you're trying to do? Is I want to show that everything's connected, everything's relational, that there's no duality and connection, that we can create a duality. And what people experience might be something else. So you will have a lot of people being indexical going, oh, what's that movie? What's that movie? What did you see that movie? Oh, who's that actor? But my aim is to move beyond that, and with something that I'd call the overwhelm. So I use all those things in the same way that if you meditate, to start with, your mind's going, blah, 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 and then it gets to a point it goes, no, like overwhelm, no. And it might be overwhelm, no. And that's what I want people to experience, is a sort of a sublime feeling of the overwhelm where they give up and surrender from their chattering minds into an experience that is a deeper experience of a lot. And I also think, I don't know if this is answering your question, but I did unmute, so I was going to say something, so it probably is this. Is we are always overwhelmed with information, and we've got our own filters that actually have to focus us. Because, I mean, for instance, everything around us in the room could get to us, like my cat keeps meowing behind me, that could drive me insane right now. And the same goes like when I was making 360 movies, which I still do, where the audience sit in the middle. You're dealing with the fact that you're making movies that only 180% of it can be seen. And then I was thinking, well, how do you deal with that? How do other people deal with that? How does the indexical deal? You overwhelm them. That's what you do. You actually throw the whole lot at them and then let them sort it out. So actually, I'm not sorting anything out for anyone. I'm laying it there, and I'm finding as much of it as I can, putting it all together, showing how they can navigate all through these doorways and through the pixels and make it into a psychedelic experience of moving through all these narratives, all these different actors in actor world, a bit like Christian Marclay's The Clock. I feel that you enter into the world of narrative, the world of actors where they are all the time, and then he's made an edit of their world. And I like to think of it in this kind of fantastical, magical way. Certainly not any kind of mourning of anything, although I understand hauntology, the purpose of all that kind of thing. But what I'm saying is I just want to present a really, really eloquent picture of the fact that everything is connected, and also that everything is a copy, but not in a hierarchical way. So in a non-linear, non-temporal way, or temporal way, there's no copy, there's just another one. And that's what I'm trying to change the language of the way we think, that we don't have to count things. And I make massive lists. So I'm I do it as well.
Yeah, I like that there's no they're all copies, but also like all the copies are originals, I guess, in Boris Groy's sense, that like each of those copies then becomes like a new original. I wanted to pick up on this, both this idea that you're saying, like the rhythm, right, where you bring something up and then you get overwhelmed. So like having like a rhythm to those productions, but also being able to produce the kind of affective feeling of being overwhelmed, which I certainly get in your work, especially as like say certain sounds start mounting and crescendoing, and you have this amazing way of playing with rhythm. I don't know. I don't think I've ever been overwhelmed by, say, an academic essay. Like that, there's something you can do in those movies that like an essay just can't do. And Craig taught me to like actually sit and read things that seem unreadable. And like having an experience of, say, Craig trying to read your parse, and I spent a long time reading parse, is profound. Profoundly different than any essay about parse could produce, and it produces a different kind of affect, a different kind of experience, and builds a different kind of like knowledge for me. And I know I'm going to connect all three of us here, all three of you here, Luca with Undocumented Press, that as a kind of performative activist poetics, you're able to do things with that press that you couldn't do in say white papers or forms of scholarship. So I thought maybe, as we get toward the end of our recording session, we can start having some kind of open conversations around some core questions that I've been thinking about and would love to hear you say more about. I'm obsessed with this idea of creative scholarship. I bring it forward in my classes. I'm very interested in, and mostly just because the normative forms of academe are so pervasive that anything that escapes them is really exciting for me, and I feel like I'm always hunting them. And I know all three of you think quite a bit about forms of creative scholarship or poetics. And I'd love to hear, your thoughts on how maybe you see your practices reflected or not in the work that I'm trying to do with the little database.
I, I'd just like to say that what I said about duality is that sometimes you get the person explaining, and then everyone else has got to listen, and that's the kind of where the performative aspect is really helpful, because you take the audience come with you. And so, if you're making a text or or audiovisual piece, if they're present in the process, it's no longer a closed end product, because there is no beginning and ending really. And these ideas that things have to have an introduction and an ending, an index, and I'd love to hear you talk about the index later. I think it's important to find these ways of performing within your medium. And since starting my PhD, I had no idea that my PhD was going to be performative, but it could not be. I had to make it this really, really long text that I started making, where I was actually giving examples of what I was talking about within it, and then making it more like a kind of rhizomatic diary. And I didn't know I was going to be doing that, but I had to, because it's so tedious doing it any other way. Full stop.
It's a great stop. I'll pick up on the index really quickly. It was the last piece of this book, and I think it really only came out with the manifold edition, where I became really obsessed with the index as a format. It's like the last thing you have to do with an academic book, is you have to like go back to the pages and try to figure out like what are the good key terms, like what are the kind of subject clusters that someone might use. But it's such an anachronistic form. Like it's very good, I guess, for the codex, but I imagine most people will encounter this book digitally and ideally in some kind of rogue archive or shadow library somewhere where they can search for the terms that they might be looking for. So I got into this like deep history around like the index and how it was formulated, and realized that it's one of these things that always comes after that, like books come first and the index has to like follow a book. I was like, oh, but I wonder, and I think increasingly with generative AI that relationship is exactly flipped on its head, right? Where large language models are these massive indexes that generate books. So the index is writing the kind of outputs that we all encounter. And so I was trying to come up with a form that would be able to express that. And again, it's one of those things where I feel like it could only be performed. So what would it look like in material practice for an index to generate a book that precedes it? And so I compiled 16 indexes into this massive index, and then generated term accurate pages using a range of large language models to write a book that would be accurate to an index. And the experiment is whatever, right? Like I think you're saying, like it can land or not with audiences. I think you could do a lot of different things with it. I haven't even read the entire thing myself. But I think it's able to. I think it opens a kind of dimension or a vantage, I guess, on indexicality in the present that I would find really impossible to articulate otherwise.
I think it's brilliant. Really, it's just wonderful. I got really excited when I saw that, because I love the idea of turning around, all the hierarchies of beginnings and ends, and where it is exactly that we think we started with this thing. Because if you have the codex book, you've got to have a certain amount of pages and size and all of that thing, and at the same time you don't want this vast kind of labyrinth. But what I love about that is the idea that it's a recipe and it's prescriptive, and you get to make what you want, but you don't know what it's going to be if someone else finds out for you, because they found out already. But that's what a book is anyway.
I want to pick up on the creative scholarship thing. So I'll begin by giving a brief outline of what undocumented press is and why I find your book really helpful for me right now, particularly as I'm going on the job market and trying to think about ways of professionalizing myself and describing the work that I do and feeling like a kind of a sellout in doing so. But I think the little database helps me for thinking of things in not so much sellout terms, but as like different media different instantiations of these objects having specific meanings depending upon the database that they're in. So I started Undocumented Press as like a project in a class of Danny for electronic poetry. And in particular, it was founded to publish one book in particular, which was called Poetry of America. And what I did is I took this horribly racist anthology of American poetry from the 19th century by William Linton, and then I ran it through. I took a PDF of it from Google Books, and I ran that PDF through a website that was going to translate it using Google Translate in the languages of the colonial domination of the New World. So English, Spanish, French, Dutch, Portuguese, and then back into English. And so it kicked up a lot of linguistic noise. It became this weird multilingual document, as well as this like kind of glitchy, strange document as a result of the PDF encodings. And then I republished it as a print-on-demand book with Lulu that looks like the hardcover copy that's at Young Research Library at UCLA. And because I was working at the library at the time, I had access to call number slips and magnetic strips. And so I fixed a call number to it, and I fixed a magnetic strip to it. And I shelved it at the research library at UCLA. And at the time, I didn't necessarily think of it in terms of creative scholarship. I just thought of it as like a synthesis of everything that I'd been doing at the time. A sort of way to escape like the bored monotonies of like my work study job too, which is an interesting thing to think about, the like sort of intersections between like making something playful out of the labor that you're kind of required to do in order to pay rent. But since then I've sort of like published and distributed these books. And Danny, I remember when I first did it, you were like, make sure you're documenting it. And I was like, well, I don't understand the point in documenting it. Why would I document it? And now that I'm on the job market, I'm like, oh man, I should really document these things. But this is all to say that the little database helps me because like I've been thinking about the terms that I use to kind of describe the work and the irony of like documenting undocumented press as like a fugitive press that shouldn't really be documented in the first place. And the point that I'm kind of getting at is that like the work has different meanings when it's on a CV, when you encounter it randomly in a library, or like when you encounter it as a PDF that's hosted to the Internet Archive. And thinking specifically about those little databases helps me to be a little bit less anxious about like me, quote unquote, selling out by like uploading attaching it to my CV and saying this is like a work of creative scholarship versus this is a work of activist literature.
I mean, you absolutely. I also write about this book. It really is just such an inspiring project, and I'm really, I'm honored and delighted to hear that. A big purpose of trying to produce this book is I've been interested in these weird forms of making, and I was lucky enough to have mentors in my graduate study and perverse librarians like Craig to encourage me from the earliest point in my academic study to explore these other modes and experimental ways of making. That I really wanted the book really dedicated to my students and potential future students that might feel enabled and empowered to make academe stranger and produce these kinds of things and find new forms of value. Of course, in the digital humanities, we're still thinking quite a bit about how to articulate, various kinds of works one has for credentialing systems, for processes of tenure. I certainly had my own challenges here at UCLA around a lot of that, but I think that's changing, and I hope that the book adds, I guess, to that change and enables those ways of making. I know that I don't know if I'm pushing too far in that direction. Like my colleague Johanna Drucker, she keeps her academic work and her poetry completely different. And she says, she doesn't want any of her colleagues to know about her creative writing and vice versa. And so I'm curious. I feel like I've been a perverse reader of Craig's for a long time. I read this amazing chapbook that he wrote, Signature Effects, as an index of Deleuze and Guattari's Thousand Plateaus. Like my first time reading A Thousand Plateaus, which I know you're interested in as well, Vicky. It was through this like weird little book of poems that Craig had written that kind of excerpted from the text. And so, but I don't know if you think of that as a kind of, Craig, who you have a prolific academic writing practice as well as a prolific experimental writing practice. I'm thinking of works like Strand or Parse in particular that take these para-academic spaces. But I'm curious how you think about, I guess, I don't know, is calling those works scholarly in some way wrong for you? Is that something you want to try and keep at arm's length? Or how do you think about those practices?
Well, I mean, unlike the rest of you, my scholarly work is not creative. It's really it's tedious and scholarly, and academic in all the bad ways. But the perverse para-academic creative books and the boring, tedious academic articles often start from exactly the same place. I'm a little embarrassed that you found that book, which is like all over the place. But I'll say two quick things about it. One is that it goes back to questions of technology and obsolescence. It was composed on a pirated copy of what was already then an outdated version of Aldous PageMaker. I was trained on letterpress. I was trained to handset metal type and ink it up because you could do things that you couldn't do in word processing programs at the time, like WordPerfect, which is what I'd been typing my papers on. And Aldous was this way of doing. This is a book that in some way that reads down through the z-axis of the page. It would have been terrible pain to try and get the registration right if I were printing this on the Vandercook. So Aldous was great for that. And I think it's the opposite of continuing to hand type HTML into plain text files. I should get whatever our version of Aldous is and make my life easier and cleaner. But the other point about the academic part is I just completed what the scholarly version of what that book began as, which was trying to think about Stéphane Mallarmé's Un coup de dé and what it would mean to read and compose by the sheet rather than the bound page. And so as I started thinking about that 30 years ago, however long ago that was, one version is this kind of terrible chapbook that's trying to do too much. But I've just now finished the other part of that, which is thinking about page space in the Deleuzian, Guattarian way via Mallarmé's printing and binding practices. So they start in the same place, but I think they're pretty siloed for me, I have to admit.
That's great. That leads into, I feel like I'm just going to voice my concerns about the book with everyone. So if on one hand, I'm concerned with thinking about this argument around creative scholarship in the book and what it affords or doesn't, I'm also really interested in trying to connect these collections online, like Eclipse and Ubu and Pen Sound, to personal hard drives. On one level, I'm trying to look through these publicly accessible collections, which to my mind really mirror how my personal hard drive is produced. These old websites, and Craig or anyone who's spent a lot of time in those file hierarchies, writing those pages by hand, it's just a series of like files and folders that one nests, just like we all do with our own hard drives and personal data collections. As we're beginning to maybe wrap up, I'm interested to hear, one, if you see your own personal collections reflected in some of these online collections, or two, how you're thinking about downloading right now in general, or having a personal collection. As book collectors, film collectors, we have like a lot of material artifacts, but are personal hard drives the same kind of thing? Are they something quite different? What is your relationship to your personal hard drive? And otherwise, if that's not too bold of me to ask.
I have so many hard drives that all the cataloging is completely futile at this point. And people keep saying, oh, you could make a server. But then I think, well, if it's all joined together, it might all just die one day. So I keep all these bits separately, and I've got about 50 hard drives. But I download everything still, even though I know it's available in places, because I don't trust that it will be tomorrow in the places that I look again. I mean, for instance, I use Anna's archive to get all of my PDFs. And I love PDFs, and they're tactile to me. I love seeing the scans and the colors and, reading them in that way. But I don't want to just stream stuff. I kind of want to have it in my house. And if I could, I'd put it in a vault somewhere. When something becomes less popular, it will disappear. In the same way that when you look at, video archives on Pirate Bay, even a TV series will disappear that might have been really important, but no one wanted to share it anymore. So I grab everything and I download everything, and I keep it myself. And when I get a new hard drive, I copy it across again in case the hard drive stops working with the operating system. So the obsolete, I'm working with the obsolete the whole time, and there's no hope in hell that I'm ever going to read all these books. But we know that isn't why we do it. Why do we do it? Why? I don't know. You say.
It is. It's some guard against erasure in the future. You're right, and I'm thinking also of like Vint Cerf's statement that if you want to preserve anything, if you want to preserve a photo, Ben Cerf, of course, the founder of the internet, provocatively said, like, you have to print it out. Otherwise, if it's on a hard drive, it will die, it will disappear. And that's one of the things that I find so inspiring about these collections is that they often disappear. Like they'll crash, or a server will go down, or a university will oust you from their servers. And it requires just a massive amount of these like repertoires of care, of downloading, of re-uploading, of maintenance, these kinds of like smaller activities that I think are like less flashy than just sort of like posting something online, but are actually just a lot of labor and a lot of time and care. And I know that's something that you also think about, Luca, in your work, and thinking about labor, especially in relationship to contingency and academe. What is your personal hard drive like, and what kind of labors does it invoke?
My personal hard drive is an absolute mess. I would say that it is a collection of folders that just say desktop dump, and it's usually everything that was on my desktop at the time, and I throw it into a folder, and I throw it on a hard drive, and that's pretty much it. There is no other good organization for it at all. But that said, these are the repertoires that I think are absolutely essential if we want things to continue existing, as you were saying, Vicky. And it's something that I kind of advocate a lot for in the report, is for people to have their own little databases that they keep on their hard drives, so that one day, when these things that we think of as too big to fail, like the Internet Archive, which very well might fail one day, we don't know for sure, because of the lawsuits that they're facing, there will be this rhizome of people, of seeders, who have continued to maintain their little databases, and then they'll upload the materials again one day, and they'll sprout out, and people will have them again. At least that's the utopian vision, right? But I also think it's also a true vision if we think about the history of sharing digital files over time. This is a separate thing, but I want to really quickly cut it in because we brought up the Internet Archive. One of the deciding factors in the Internet Archive versus Hatchet case was the question of whether or not a scan of a book was sufficiently transformative of like a publisher's book in order to make it not a copyright infringement for the Internet Archive to do. So the Internet Archive had scanned all these books that were technically still commercially available, and they had made them available through controlled digital lending. And publishers, including Hatchet and other big groups, sued and said that this was copyright infringement. And the court failed to recognize that there is some fundamental transformation that happens when you scan a physical book. Craig, I'm sure you understand this as well, somebody who does Eclipse. These are fundamentally different objects, the physical book, the scan of the physical book, and a publisher's ebook. And the court failed to recognize that. And as a result, there's been like a great blow against both the Internet Archive and the accessibility and availability of digital resources more broadly. So there are like these very real political stakes to the kind of work that you're doing, Danny, where you're paying close attention to file types and formats. Not the least because if we don't pay attention to them, then courts might not pay attention to them. And that means down the line that people don't have access to them across the world.
Oh, that's really nice. Yeah, I think that's one, just so true and so important. And of course, access is always a challenge, right? These paradoxical vicissitudes that digital culture is subject to, where they build the same corporate entities that they're attempting to resist. These shadow libraries, and Joe Cargadas and others have written about, quite a bit about how important that is, say, for the global South to be able to access, or anyone actually outside of institutional bodies that have access to things like JSTOR, to be able to do research and be able to access these kinds of materials. It goes in both directions. And I think just taking those transformative effects seriously. And on one hand, I was thinking, yeah, the like transformative effects are a really strong argument for at least the way the Supreme Court has litigated copyright around transformation, especially if it comes to media specific works. But otherwise, I kind of have avoided a lot of those questions of copyright in the book, just because I feel like so many of these conversations about these digital materials often just boil down to copyright, and that they have these like rich, meaningful lives outside of just those moments. I'm even just thinking about desktop dump. One, I would love to see what's in that folder. It might be that's a great idea for like I don't know, like a digital magazine that's just desktop dump that releases these desktops, and you see a lot. Like I feel every desktop is also kind of memoir or a kind of autobiography, and more akin to, say, like a writer's library than anything else we might have at present. Speaking of which, because I know that, Craig, you think about libraries and you also stay so organized. I've always been curious. I mean, Eclipse is meticulously organized on the back end. Do your own personal hard drives mirror Eclipse, or conversely, has Eclipse always mirrored your own personal hard drives?
No, they're much closer to the dump. I'm like Vicky. I back up the backups of the backups because they do. I mean, as we know from Eclipse, the CDs that contain the original scans have already deteriorated, and what looked like they were going to be, the archive of the archive has already crumbled. So that's, this is not a paranoid fear. It's just what happens even to the gel inside those CDs. But let me just make a plug for the adjacent conversation that Memory of the World has had around amateur librarianship, which is one way. I like the shadow archive arguments, but I think the case they make for everyone being an amateur librarian, which is just corroborating what Luca said, is very rhetorically very powerful.
Excellent. Yeah, and thinking about Memory of the World, Anna's Archive, which also, I think what makes Anna's Archive so great is that they have like rich metadata, finally, right? That you can, like, the searches are accurate, the titles are accurate. Like, there's an enormous amount of work to make it highly functional, to make a space for users that's also supported by the community. It's one of so many shadow libraries and these kinds of collections that I didn't get to write about in the book. Like, a book is a bounded thing. And as much as I wanted to like radiate out into all these various source materials, there's only so much that I could access. So as we wrap up this podcast, I thought maybe just as one last question, and this is inspired a little bit maybe by Al Vilries, who always ends his podcasts with a gathering paradise, a chance for everyone to just point to something that either you want to plug, if there's like weird or unlikely or favorite little databases that you might have that are worth mentioning, or any other work. For my part, the middle of Not Equals, which is currently up on Eclipse Archive with thanks to Craig, transforms what Language Magazine used to do is list all the other little magazines that were running, and they would be very hard to find in these kind of underground Xerox networks of experimental writers. You would get the name of the editor, the address, the cost, and you'd be able to write to purchase a copy directly from those editors. In my updated version, I produced a list of a few dozen little databases that I wish I had a chance to write about. So I will direct potential listeners to that section of the Not Equals language project. And I think, as I put it in the book, little databases that might be able to test some of the arguments that I'm trying to make, or even better, refute them or resist them in ways that I can't imagine. I'm so grateful for this conversation. I wish that I feel like there's already dozens of things that I want to follow up with each of you on after our official recorded space. But perhaps we can make just one last round if there's anything that you would like to plug or point to before we bid our listeners adieu.
I'd like to shout out the Future Knowledge podcast that's ongoing right now with the Internet Archive and Authors Alliance. Anybody who's interested in learning more about issues of contemporary copyright could check that out. It's rolling out and it's really good.
I'll say something that's maybe going to seem unrelated, but I think is actually deeply related to what we've been talking about, which is a book by Rory McCartney and Charlie Morgan called Heated Words, Searching for a Mysterious Typeface. It's the cultural history of faux black letter iron-on letter forms that were part of youth culture in the 70s. And I'll leave the obliquity there, but everyone should read it anyway.
Okay, I've got one. It's not brand new, but it's not that old. In Praise of Copying, Marcus Boone. I've got so many bookmarks in that book. It's a great inspiration. And I like the way he ties it in with Buddhist thinking as well, which is something I've not mentioned, but so much of my thinking comes from non-duality and interconnectedness. So Marcus Boone, In Praise of Copying.
Ah, wonderful. Well, thank you all, and I'll just conclude by sending my heartfelt thanks and plugging and pointing to the works that all three of you continue to make and continue to inspire my own practice. This has been a real delight to be able to join you in conversation, and want to extend gratitude also to the University of Minnesota Press, and in particular Margaret Sattler, for helping us record and produce this podcast. Thank you for listening.
This has been a University of Minnesota Press production. The book The Little Database, A Poetics of Media Formats, is available from University of Minnesota Press. It is also available in an open access edition at manifold.umn.edu. Thank you for listening.